Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I would like...
Mesdames et messieurs, bonjour. J'aimerais vous proposer d'entamer notre séminaire ALDE sur les prisonniers politiques russes. Au nom des libéraux et démocrates européens, je tiens à vous souhaiter la bienvenue. Merci d'être présent parmi nous. C'est un événement très particulier aujourd'hui, consacré à un sujet très important, les prisonniers politiques russes, avec des personnalités très particulières, des gens qui sont venus de Moscou, de Londres et d'autres endroits encore. Et je suis ravi de pouvoir vous annoncer que nous aurons les dirigeants de l'opposition russe, des partisans des droits de l'homme, des défenseurs des droits de l'homme russes, et des personnes qui luttent contre la corruption, la violation des droits de l'homme en Russie et en Europe. Donc je pense qu'on peut dire qu'on a tout un événement
emblematic and symbolic for the entire Europe, due to their courage, due to their dedication. And as a spokesman, as an ALDE spokesman on human rights, I would like to make a couple of points before we start our seminar. We know that, in fact, human rights, the whole human rights saga in Europe is a very interesting combination of Russian, Ukrainian, East European courage and Western organization. It was not before the Helsinki Accords, it was not before the Helsinki Group and the Helsinki Watch in the United States and the Helsinki groups in Moscow that the entire saga emerged. And I'm so happy that we have with us a legendary figure. We have the real founding mother of the Moscow-Helsinki group, Ms. Lyudmila Alexeyeva, which is a great honor for us. And I have to say that the human rights issues, they shouldn't be taken very lightly for granted as a West European or North American specificity or invention. Very far from it. We know that without people like Andrei Sakharov, Yelena Bonner, Vladimir Sinyavsky, Vladimir Bukovsky, you name them, without the greatest Russian dissidents and human rights activists, the whole human rights story would have been unthinkable. We know that even the Supreme Award, the European Parliament Supreme Award for democracy and human rights and freedom of expression is named after the greatest Russian dissidents, Andrei Sakharov. I could add Chinese and other great dissidents all over the world whose courage and dedication made it all possible. And of course, much to my delight, the European Union is unthinkable now without its dedication to civil liberties, fundamental rights, and human rights all over Europe. But I have to say that we face a great paradox. In the 1980s and 90s, it was obvious that it was the democratic Russia which made it possible that the collapse of the Soviet Union, I think one of the miracles in modern history, became possible. It was precisely due to their courage. We know that there were remarkable things, the independence of my country, Lithuania, there were some other challenges, but honestly, I cannot imagine the collapse of the Soviet Union otherwise than through Russian Democrats, Russian human rights defenders, and of course, then it was the rest of the story. Then it was the crisis and bankruptcy of the Soviet Union, then it was the victory of the West in the Cold War, but it would have been impossible without these people who became a litmus test of the century, who became the most pivotal, the central part of the whole saga. And well, what happened? What happened next was that after 1990, when we felt that the new phase of world history began, we had very high hopes that Russia would become an absolutely reliable partner, probably would change the whole course of history due to its commitments to democracy and human rights. And the era of Yeltsin, of Boris Yeltsin, was very promising. But we know that that was not to be. After Yeltsin, Russia again had a very difficult phase in its history, and now we have a paradoxical situation when Russia, which is not the Soviet Union anymore, which is, one would think, a normal country with unlimited possibilities to build an absolutely normal civilized state, all of a sudden Russia is sliding back into the abyss of Soviet legislation, producing laws like the laws about NGOs, where NGOs are described as foreign agents. And anybody who is fluent in Russian knows that this has a very special connotation in the Russian language, because a foreign agent is tantamount to foreign spy. And again, we have a very strange déjà vu, or a sort of, the repetition of history. And I have to say that this sends many messages and addresses many issues. What is to be done next? On the one side, we agree on the pivotal, crucial significance of Russia as a country, as a nation. Everybody, I think everybody is in love with Russian modern culture. And at the same time, it's obvious that we are at the crossroads. Should we lower the standards for countries which are pivotally important for trade, economics, like China and Russia, or should we try to apply those same global standards regarding human dignity, human rights, civil liberties? Sometimes it's not very easy even for ourselves to define things the way they are. Sometimes we think that there should be some different applications or different kinds of, dynamics. But in fact, if we fail, if we try to lower the standard, then I think it would be an historic failure, because it was Russian dissidents. It was people like Solzhenitsyn, like Sakharov and the rest of them, who raised those things. They shaped the entire discourse on human rights. And that's why if we slide back into some kind of ambivalence on this, we would betray their great mission. Without further ado, I would like to say that Russian political prisoners sounds like a very hot topic. It's not an overstatement. Russian political dissidents exist in Russia. We know that Mikhail Khodorkovsky spent almost 10 years in prison for nothing. For nothing, he became an emblematic figure, a symbolic figure, and I think we would easily agree that Mikhail Khodorkovsky ceased being just a Russian political prisoner. He is, in a way, a European figure who sends us a message about what it's like to fight corruption, what it's like to stand for human rights. As long as corruption exists as international phenomenon, it would be quite naive to confine it to Russia or any other country. We understand that every fighter against corruption and every fighter for human rights becomes an international figure. It's not for them, it's for us. These people fight for Europe. That's why I wouldn't like us to misconceive the whole situation, portraying Mikhail Khodorkovsky or the late Sergei Magnitsky as Russian figures. Yes, they are Russian heroes, but at the same time, they are European heroes. They fight for all of us. And that's why I would rephrase and reword the whole event by saying that they are European political prisoners. They are European prisoners of conscience. And it's up to us to decide where we stand concerning our standards, our criteria, our value system, our orientation for the future. Let me introduce very briefly our speakers today. They are the former Prime Minister Mikhail Kasyanov. He will be the first to address us. Then we will have Ms. Lyudmila Alexeyeva, the great founder of the Helsinki Group in Moscow. We will have Vadim Klyuvgant, lawyer of Mr. Khodorkovsky and Mr. Nikolai Kavkazky. We will have Mr. Bill Browder, Hermitage Capital Management, Ms. Anna Karetnikova, Council of Human Rights Center Memorial, Mr. Vladimir Kara-Murza, Coordinator Council of the Russian Opposition, and of course we have Mr. Pavel Khodorkovsky, President of the Institute of Modern Russia, who is frequent here in the European Parliament, much to my delight. So it's a great honor, ladies and gentlemen, and with your kind consent, without further ado, I would like to ask Mr. Mikhail Kasyanov, political leader of the People's Democratic Union and co-leader of the Republican Party of People's Freedom, or Parnas, to say some opening remarks, to offer some opening remarks. Mr. Kasyanov, the floor is yours.
Спасибо огромное, господин председатель.
Thank you, Chair. Friends, I'm delighted to welcome you all here to the European Parliament. I'm delighted that I have the opportunity to speak in Russian here at the European Parliament. Because, of course, when we are talking about important issues relating to Russian, it's really important to have the Russian language present there, an important factor to improve our communication when we're talking about our country. Unfortunately, today we are seeing a real problem in the Russian Federation, the problem of Russian political prisoners. And even 20 years ago, we couldn't have imagined that the Russian Federation, which had chosen the path towards democratic construction, would see a situation when political prisoners are held. That is a shame for the Russian people and for the Russian state today. Yes, it is a fact. There are political prisoners in Russia today. Mikhail Khodorkovsky, his colleague Lebedov, another example. Pussy Riot. Sergei Magnitsky, who was beaten to death in prison. And also those who demonstrated on the 6th of May, the demonstrations which took place in May last year, when the authorities provoked the demonstrators. They used violence against them, and currently criminal cases are being held against young representatives of the demonstrators. The case is underway against those who are accused in the 6th of May case, and I think we will hear about different aspects of this today. Of course, this is an unjust situation. Our political party has created a social commission to organize an independent investigation of the events of the 6th of May. We have leading human rights activists involved in that. We've got Lyudmila Alexeyeva here with us today. She was the head of our social commission, but we had people on the commission who were independent of the authorities, who could say what they thought, who could express their authority and to say what they thought was essential to guarantee that the truth is uncovered about this case. What happened in May last year were not riots. It was the expression of violence of the authority following the election of President Putin once again to the presidency of the Russian Federation. The authorities simply could not accept that citizens in the Russian capital were expressing their dissatisfaction with the illegitimacy of President Putin's election. This was a politically motivated attack on Russian citizens in the Russian capital in Bolotnaya Square. We believe that the state needs to think about what's happening here. They need to recognize the mistakes which they have made. They are making victims of these young people who are sitting in prison today. They are innocent. They are waiting for their sentences to be read. We think that the state is acting in the only way which it seems possible to maintain its position. Now, this is not just one story which you can find today in Russia. We're looking at the European Court of Human Rights, and we know that the largest number of cases which are examined by that court come from the Russian Federation. I think it's about a third of the cases in front of the Human Rights Court. Yes, there are thousands of cases where Russian citizens are appealing to this court to receive compensation. No one is aware of what's going on in Russia. There is a taboo on discussing this in Russia. The Russian state is supposed to pay 7,000 euros to the victims. There is a lot of money available in our country, and the state in Russia is spending this money to pay out for the offences which it has committed. But what about political evaluation? Our country is a member of the Council of Europe, and there needs to be a political evaluation of what's going to be on, and we need to be able to politically judge. The Russian Federation is a member of the Council of Europe, and as such it must live up to its obligations which it signed up to in joining that organisation. The Russian Federation has signed up to the European Convention of Human Rights, but is not fulfilling the standards which that document has inscribed in it. And there needs to be an evaluation of this. So it's not surprising that many politicians in the European Union consider that President Putin and his colleagues need to be criticized on their approach to human rights. Now another issue, Platon Lebedev and Mikhail Khodorkovsky. The most highly distinguished lawyers in our country who have evaluated this case, and they have come to the conclusion that everything relating to this case is fabricated. They should be released. The independent experts who do not have any links to political circles have been clear on this. The experts have done their evaluation and they have signed a document expressing their position. They have carried out their evaluation. They have looked at all aspects of this. And one of those involved in them, Sergei Guriev, was forced to flee from the country because he feared for his arrest. This is politically motivated persecution of citizens who have spoken out against the authorities in Russia. Of course, in the European Parliament, there is a resolution which is being drafted at the present time. Hopefully it will be adopted soon, relating to human rights cases in the Russian Federation. Of course, it's essential that this document is adopted. I would like to encourage all the members of the European Parliament to support this document. Not for real politic reasons, but because you need to stick to your principles, the values which join us together. And thinking about those in the 6th of May case, whose trial starts tomorrow, I would like to also appeal to you to draft a resolution on this case so that the Russian Federation authorities are forced to think about what's going on and to release these young people. One further issue, a topical issue which is of great concern when we're discussing human rights. Of course, Sergei Magnitsky, the tragic story, his death. We know the story, we cannot be indifferent to it. This case continues. The need for justice, the need for a fair investigation, this will continue. And it continues to be the subject of attention of human rights defenders and politicians. The American Congress adopted its Magnitsky Act, which states that those people involved in the Magnitsky case, in his torture, in his death, human rights violators, they are not to travel to the United States. And they have also cannot hold financial assets in the United States. The European Parliament has also adopted a resolution and recommended its country's governments to adopt similar legislation. This is not an attack on the Russian Federation, on its citizens. It's not a sanction against the Russian Federation. It is a limitation of the privileges of human rights violators who are criminals, who violate the standards of the Council of Europe, who violate the principles of the European Convention of Human Rights and Fundamental Freedoms. We would like to see a speeding up of the process of the adoption of political dialogue within your country so we can see the implementation of this legislation. This would be a real support for the Russian human rights movement, real support for Russian Democrats, real support for the construction of a democratic state in the Russian Federation, as is enshrined in our constitution. Today, in response to the adoption of the Magnitsky Act, the Russian state has responded. This is seen as a threat to the vertical of power in the Russian Federation, and in response the Russian Federation called for the introduction of a visa-free regime with the European Union. So Russian citizens have privileges, or the Russian elite will have privileges when they continue to travel to the European Union, but ordinary Russian citizens will continue to suffer. And so this is an important point. The changes to the visa regime, the changes for the 3-year visas, the 5-year visas for ordinary citizens, for students, businessmen, and so on. So the situation is such that the Russian authorities are saying, well, if you don't give visa-free travel to Russian civil servants, you're going to see limitations to the movement of ordinary Russian citizens. This is not acceptable. And I hope that the governments of the European Union will not respond to these calls from the Russian authorities and will not grant special privileges to those who do not deserve them. So, friends, when speaking here, I always believe that we are joined together by common values. We must help one another. This is a moral responsibility. We are all members of the Council of Europe. We have all signed up to agreements which mean that we must stand by the principles and the values which join us. Thank you.
Благодарю вас, господин Касьянов. Thank you very much indeed. And now I have a pleasure and an honor to give the floor to Ms. Lyudmila Alexeyeva, Moscow-Helsinki Committee. And I think everybody knows that Ms. Lyudmila Alexeyeva is one of the towering figures in Russian dissent, in Russian dissident movement. And I would describe her as the founding mother of the Moscow-Helsinki Group. Госпожа Алексеева, это большая честь для нас. Вы оказали огромную честь.
You have shown us a great honor by agreeing to come to talk to us, and please, the floor is yours. First of all, thank you for the invitation. I think that this is exactly the right time to give us the opportunity to speak here today. This is because tomorrow is the beginning of the trial of the prisoners of the 6th of May. And this trial brings together all the problems that we see in the new trend that we see in politics, the new trend that followed the start of the 3rd presidential term of Vladimir Putin. The relationship between state and society is no longer based on the social contract. It's based on a new social contract, which is, we will make sure that you have a good standard of material living, and in exchange you have to give up a certain number of your rights and not bother us. This was, in fact, the social contract in the first 2 terms of Putin's presidency. But in the 3rd term, this social contract had run its course because the state had not fulfilled its part of the social contract. If you look at the 2nd chapter of the Russian Constitution, Rights and Freedoms of Citizens, then it's clear, to me at least, perhaps not to everyone, we have actually lost all the civil rights put down in the Constitution, with one exception. The one exception is the freedom to leave one's country and to return to one's own country. This freedom we still have. But what was demanded was to keep quiet in exchange for improving material standards of living. Putin talked about the dictatorship of the law. In other words, the law has to be absolute. In the 1990s, after the fall of the Soviet Union, there was a lack of order. People wanted law, they wanted order. And what we have now is, in fact, complete lawlessness. And this isn't just something I'm saying to shock you, lawlessness. This is actually the case. Our legislative branch, the State Duma, since the December following the protests about the elections, this Duma has been passing a whole range of laws, each more terrible than the last, restricting rights, restricting the rights of categories of citizens, and these are bad for everyone in Russia. For example, the law on state secrets, which has already been voted, which is already in force. Well, it's not actually in force yet, but it could come into force at any moment. And we are here in Brussels to tell you about what's happening with human rights in our country. And this could be dangerous for us, because under the new law, we could be threatened with quite a long time in prison. I don't know which of us are actually in danger of this in reality, but if we look at our laws, they are being passed and can be used completely selectively, arbitrarily. It's complete lawlessness. For example, the law on registration of residence, which has been in force since 1861, when serfdom was abolished. And it changed when Khrushchev gave residence documents to farmers who had before then been serfs in all but name. But under today's Russian constitution, citizens have the right to freedom of movement. But the law now says, no, you don't have freedom of movement. You stay where you're registered, where your official residence is. And if you don't, then you get a fine of 500,000 rubles, which is an incredible amount of money to the average citizen. And if you don't pay the fine, you go to prison. And everything that I've said, the law on NGOs, the law on registration, all these laws and the case with Yukos, the experts who express themselves on this, the whole situation is unclear for the moment. But everything has been concentrated now on the prisoners of the 6th of May. And who are these people, actually? They are ordinary people of Moscow. None of the organizers of these meetings are actually arrested. These prisoners are simply people who are arrested at random in the crowd, who are arrested because they agreed with the aims of these meetings. Normal people, people who came to demonstrate peacefully, people who came with their children, who thought that everything would be absolutely fine. They were arrested, taken prisoner at random, and among these people There are some who had never demonstrated before in their lives. And they are accused of taking part in massive disruptions of order. Now, in Europe, you've seen actual disorder in Greece, in France, in Italy, even in Sweden. You know what riots actually look like. And if you read this brochure, you will know that there weren't any riots whatsoever. There was no violence on the side of protesters. There was violence against the protesters, against innocent people not accused of anything, by the state. Riot police attacked ordinary citizens who weren't expecting a thing, and of course these demonstrators fought back when they were being beaten up, and helped others who were being beaten up. And this is what they're accused of. There were people there who had been to an unauthorized demonstration for the first time in their lives. And they're now faced with many years in prison for that. For participation in riots, when there weren't actually any riots. The riots were invented to be as an excuse to give people long terms in prison. So what can I say about this? Well, first of all, I can say that there weren't any riots. That all the mass events in Russia are peaceful, and I am proud of this. This proves that our nation, which has never lived under democracy, is ready for democracy. That our people are ready to defend their rights peacefully without using violence. That's the first thing I had to say. Secondly, these people who were picked up at random did not expect this to happen. Every one of them, even in prison, remembered that they were citizens. They said, we did not do anything, we are innocent, we simply demonstrated peacefully, and we are using our civic right to freedom of assembly and freedom to protest peacefully. There were 70,000 people at the meetings, possibly more. And citizens were arrested at random. And I can be proud of them and say that they were heroes. They were heroes to be as brave as they were in the situation they were forced into. We support them how we can. This is extremely important to us. Because why is the government arresting people at random? Because they expect these people to be terrified and say, yes, we know we were rioting, please forgive us, please don't hurt us. They want scapegoats. This is, and I'm not exaggerating, this is what Stalin did in the 1930s. Arrested random people who were scared and then said, look, you see, of course they're guilty. They themselves are confessing. It is essential that the trial of the 6th of May, where our heroes will be in the dock, this trial must not turn into a repeat of 1937. We are supporting the accused. We are helping them. And I beg you to help them and to support them as well. It is important for all of us. Not just for them, not just for Russia, for everyone. Because if the heroes of the 6th of May become the victims of a Stalinist show trial, then we will simply no longer be believed. But if this happens, Russia will be worse than in Brezhnev's times, and everyone will say that. Of course, not worse than under Stalin. That would be impossible in the 21st century. But that's the danger. Russia will be worse than under Brezhnev in the Soviet Union, and you will be in danger if you have such a neighbor. Remember this. You are scared of these consequences, and the heroes of the 6th of May are not scared. They are fighting for their rights. Be like them, support them, fight for them. Thank you.
Благодарю вас. Спасибо. Now I have a pleasure and honor to give the floor to Mr. Mikhail Khodorkovsky, President of the Institute of Modern Russia.
Thank you very much. First of all, I'd like to express my gratitude for being given the opportunity to speak here and for being invited. February 6th of 2012 was a very important date in the framework of today's topic. On that day, Vladimir Putin declared, then the Prime Minister of Russia, that we do not have political prisoners in our country. On April 25th, 2013, during his annual phone-in with the citizens, he repeated this mantra, now being the President of the Russian Federation once again. He repeated this assertion that we do not have political prisoners in our country. So when we talk about the problem of political prisoners in Russia, we have to frame it in this context of Mr. Putin's view, because unfortunately, as it became abundantly clear in the last couple of years, when it comes to political prisoners and people like my father that had the unfortunate fate of becoming one of those political prisoners, it's the President Putin's view. That's the only view in Russia that matters. But does that suggest that the president is in denial of the fact that we have political prisoners? I don't believe that he is in denial. He's been renowned for being very much a streetwise person. He cannot be in denial, at least not genuinely, because he is the ultimate arbiter of the so-called vertical of power. And that vertical depends on the justice system, or to be more exact, on the subjugation of the justice system to maintain the political power and the omnipresence of Mr. Putin himself. And that by definition means that he and his cronies use justice as a political tool, as a weapon to elevate their own position and keep their opponents down. So President Putin knows quite well that there are political prisoners in Russia. And he knows it primarily because he's the one that created them. He designed a system that arrests and locks up those who challenge his rule. Then why does he refute the existence of political prisoners? He refutes their existence because he needs to silence dissent without sacrificing his public image. So certainly as his popularity continues to ebb in the last couple of years, and as Russians become wary of his constant presence in their lives, he needs to appeal to his core constituency. President Putin's supporters share his values, and above all, a strong Russia that prioritizes the discipline, certainty, and stability that he once used to represent. In this Russia, dissenters are not tolerated. At best, they are dismissed as eccentric and misguided. Often they are labeled unpatriotic and portrayed as pawns of the liberal Americans and Europeans. Sometimes, when they're a genuine threat, the state concocts a criminal case against them, as it did twice in case of my father. And that's why it's so easy for the Kremlin to claim there are no political prisoners in Russia. Yet for those who fought against the rigidity of the Soviet state, like Lyudmila Mikhailovna, it must be a very disappointing case of déjà vu. I think that President Putin denies the existence of political prisoners because he simply doesn't care if people think that he's lying. And in fact, President Putin long ago gave up on caring what most people think about him. And that indifference has been apparent in my father's case. The Kremlin assertion of Amnesty International's designation of my father as a prisoner of conscience is that it's irrelevant. For President Putin, his response to the International Bar Association report on the second Khodorkovsky trial would typically be, who cares? For President Putin, the opinion of the eminent and distinguished members of the Presidential Council on Human Rights that issued a report, an extensive report on the second trial of my father, that said that it was a farce and requires the verdict to be annulled. For him, it counts for nothing. And after all, that report was commissioned under then President Medvedev. This suggests to me that the fate of political prisoners in Russia will not change as long as the system, the political system in Russia, remains as it is today. In fact, it's clear that as opposition to the regime increases, the authorities will have to use political repression more frequently and more violently. If President Putin truly cared about the future of the Russian people, he would reform. But reform is not part of their vocabulary. It risks compromising the entire edifice on which the structure has been built to date. And no, President Putin's response to opposition is instinctively to silence it, either by locking up individuals, such as my father, or by using law enforcement to intimidate and subdue the citizenry, like in the cases of the 6th of May demonstrators. A pessimist would say on that evidence that things in Russia will get worse. And it could be so. But I am, for once, very optimistic about the future prospects. And I believe that things in Russia will get better. The speed at which that happens is directly related to the Kremlin's political strategy. President Putin seems to have fought himself into a corner. I frankly think that for him, reform means jeopardizing everything that sustains him. Yet, repression means emboldening an opposition that steadily grows stronger and more vociferous. Herein lies the Putin paradox, yet another paradox that we have today. Somehow that paradox is going to stretch things to the breaking point in Russia. And that's the reason why I'm relatively upbeat as to the prospects of reform in my country. One of the President Putin's core beliefs is that Western liberal democracy is somehow un-Russian. And it's a belief justified, as he says, by memories of the chaotic 90s under Boris Yeltsin. But in reality, this belief is not based on either evidence or intellectual philosophy. It's based on the simple equation that Western liberal democracy is incompatible with the acquisition of unchallenged power. And it's incompatible with the maintenance of a political system based on corruption, as it is the case today in Russia. It's incompatible with the manipulation of the judiciary to sustain such power. In other words, it's not that the Western liberal democracy is no good for Russia. It's simply no good for Kremlin. So instead, Mr. Putin architected what became known as a sovereign democracy. And for a while, this authoritarian model worked, and it worked well. But as Russia recovered from the financial meltdown of the 98 and Russians became wealthier, today the disenchantment with President Putin and his policies is becoming clearer. This is partly to do with his stranglehold on power and his refusal to allow genuine alternatives to flourish. It's also partly to do with pervasive corruption. After all, a kleptocratic regime in which people are tired of paying bribes and being extorted really eliminates the very base of support in the long run. It's also partly to do with the gradual slowdown in economic growth. That social contract, which has been mentioned previously today, is no longer in place. The middle class that was initially enthusiastic about the growth of their purchasing power is becoming disenchanted because the economic growth is slowing down. So these factors are now all coming together, and they're making Russians impatient for change. However, as I've already said, I have my doubts as to whether the current regime is flexible enough to change and to reform. So can the Kremlin both satisfy the aspiration of millions of people who want a genuine democracy while at the same time keeping its grip on ultimate power in Russia? I don't think so. Certainly the lesson we draw from democracy in Europe is that something has got to give in this equation. And to my mind, the situation will only be resolved by President Putin leaving office voluntarily, which would be ideal, constitutionally, at the end of his term, or, and that's the worst case scenario for everyone involved, as a result of mass spread protests in Russia. So after all, many people around him will want to maintain the system, even if Mr. Putin himself is a political liability. So my view is more optimistic, and that's primarily because I have faith in the Russian people. After all, we've become too smart and too stubborn and too globalized to go on living in the state like this. We have experienced a degree of economic freedom in the past couple of years, and we're now demanding economic and democratic freedom at the same time. The example of Europe is an inspiration here, because ultimately the desire of citizens to build a better society cannot be stopped. And that also has been the long-time view of my father. In fact, back in 2001, he founded the Open Russia Foundation to help build a stronger civil society. He also funded opposition parties, both left and right, to help nurture a pluralistic political environment. And 10 years ago, those actions landed him in jail. Throughout his time in prison, he's been focused on the future, not his own future, which remains in the hands of President Putin, as I mentioned, but on Russia's future as a country. He has written many books and articles outlining his vision of Russia's political, economic, and social development. He is engaged in lengthy public correspondence with opposition leaders, human rights activists, and journalists. And he's very much grateful. He's grateful for the support that he has received from both inside and outside Russia. And I want to extend to the members of the European Parliament my gratitude and my father's profound thanks for the constant solidarity that we continue to receive throughout the 10 years of his imprisonment. I want to thank in particular the ALDE Group for its patronage of this important event, which marks my father's 50th anniversary later this month, on the 26th of June. This support sustains him through very dark and difficult times. It's not only the absence of his family and his physical isolation, but also the dizzying legal merry-go-round of his cases that continue to perpetrate and characterize his case. So let me give you a couple of updates of what has been happening lately. So as things stand today, he is due to be released in October of 2014. There's been a reduction in his sentence at the end of last year. But my real concern here is the possibility of the third set of charges. We know that Russian investigative committee is constantly investigating my father and his associates, and they're trying to come up with a new set of charges. Things may be quiet for now, especially in light of the upcoming Sochi Olympics in the beginning of next year, because President Putin wants everything to go as smoothly as possible. It's a landmark event for him. But he certainly doesn't want people to think about the deterioration of the human rights record and the political prisoners while people are enjoying the Sochi Games. But after the Games finish, there could be a renewed legal assault on my father and on other political prisoners and people who have participated in the protests in the past couple of years. Certainly, if the case of Alexei Navalny, for example, is anything to go by, the regime maintains its desire to lock up every single political opponent that dares to challenge Putin's strong hold on power. And of course, today's event is not only about my father. His case is only the most prominent in the latest couple of cases that have been developing in Russia. But the real tragedy is the fact that it's not the only one, by far. There's been many cases of political prisoners in the past 13 years, and the number of those cases continue to grow. After all, if my father has been concerned primarily about his own freedom, he would have asked for pardon. He would have knelt down and asked Mr. Putin to set him free, as Mr. Putin has suggested a number of times he does. But that has been my father's determination not to do so, and continue to fight not only for his own freedom, but also for freedom of other prisoners in Russia. Unfortunately, as long as he and others remain in prison, Russia as a whole, as a country, will not be free. And I'm convinced that this change for internal freedom can only come from within. But Europe has a strong role to play here in helping to shape and support developments in Russia. The European Union should dramatically increase its support for the civil society organizations in the face of the unprecedented recent campaign of intimidation, linked up with the new changes in the legislation inside Russia. EU leaders need to think very carefully about surrendering one of the biggest aces that they have in their deck right now. That ace is the visa policy. Visa liberalization is a good thing in principle, and I believe that Russian citizens should be able to travel more freely and enjoy a beneficial visa regime, but that should not be centered around serving the desires of service passport holders. Because ultimately, you don't want the corrupt and violent bureaucrats, amongst some of them responsible for the persecution and death of Sergei Magnitsky, to be able to gain visa-free access to the European Union. Because that could happen very soon if the momentum towards the visa liberalization process is maintained for those holders of the service passports. At the very least, member states could agree that legislation that prevents Russian human rights abusers from entering the EU, a sort of EU Magnitsky Act, like the one by the US Congress, could be linked to the visa liberalization accord. You saw the furious reaction from Russia's leaders to what Congress did. It was a sign of just how much they value the sort of access that comes by being able to travel outside of Russia, park their assets, and enjoy the freedoms that they deny their own citizens inside my country. Well, imagine how much more profound the effect would be in Europe, given its proximity and given the fact that Russian bureaucrats frankly view Europe as their backyard. So Europe has leverage over Russia and has the potential to reshape and recalibrate this relationship that has been manipulated by Moscow for far too long, I believe. Europe should use that leverage, and it must put issues of governance and human rights at the heart of this EU-Russian partnership. Failure to do so would be betrayal of Europe's values, values for which many members of this House fought and suffered during the Soviet years. After all, only a generation ago, there were political prisoners inside now the European member states. And I don't think that we should forget that yet. The Russian government, the Kremlin, would certainly like us to forget. And it would like us to think that those who claim political motivation for their imprisonment are nothing but common criminals. And it certainly wages PR campaigns to try and portray them as such. But, for example, in case of my father, of what is he guilty? He's guilty of being a businessman that has been successful. He's guilty of being a philanthropist who was way too generous. He's guilty of being a visionary when such vision was incompatible with the government's view of Russia's future. And as I mentioned, my father turns 50 on the 26th of June. For him, it will be his 10th birthday that he will be celebrating in jail. I'd like to call on you to show your support. My father's website ran a competition earlier this month for a birthday card design. And you can send him your own version electronically, and it will be printed and delivered to him in jail. You can do so outside as you leave. We have a little stand that will be set up. Or you can just go to Khodorkovsky.com. Please share the card with your friends on social media and help to spread the word. It would help and sustain my father in prison. You know, it's the 10th year. You know, if he stays in prison until October of 2013, it will mark exactly 10 years of his imprisonment. It's been lonely 10 years. And the last time we saw each other, I was 18, he was 40, and it felt like it was almost a lifetime ago. It was in a completely different time, and that back then in a completely different country. But to you, Lyudmila Mikhailovna, to what you've been saying about the comparison between Russia of today and Russia of the 1937, I believe a lot has changed. You know, we're not the same people, and it's not the same country. So that's why I'm very optimistic as to what's going to happen in what I believe the nearest future. So please help in this very important year to secure my father's release. You know, his continued imprisonment is a scandal, and not only inside Russia, but also outside, because I'm very grateful for the description of my father as not only being a Russian political prisoner, but a European political prisoner, because cases like his stand in the way of partnership between the EU and Russia. Incentivizing the Russian government to reform, incentivizing Russia as a country to progress, will ultimately make this relationship a much more fruitful one, and will benefit not only the bureaucrats that want to gain visa-free access in the EU, but will benefit 142 million people, my own fellow citizens that live in Russia and want to be part of Europe. So help me secure his release, and more so, not for his or my family's own right. You know, after all, a lot has happened in the past 10 years. I've got married. I now have a daughter that my father has not yet had a chance to meet in person. She's now 3.5. But more so that Russia as a country and my fellow citizens can be equal partners in this relationship. Thank you.
Mr. Pavel Khodorkovsky, thank you very much indeed. Now, Mr. Vadim Klyuvgan, who is lawyer of Mr. Mikhail Khodorkovsky and Mr. Nikolai Kavkazky. Mr. Klyuvgan, the floor is yours.
Спасибо.
Thank you. Chair, members of the European Parliament, colleagues, guests, friends, good afternoon, and thank you for organising this event and for your invitation to take part. Now, of course, it's very important to us that you are paying attention to our cause and helping us. Now, as my friends have already said, I think that there is an interest on the part of a united Europe is in what is going on in our country, and this was the case in the past. This goes back to a time when Russia wasn't just a provider of oil and gas, but when we were the evil opponent, when we were divided on the other side of the wall. So I really think thank you very much. Now, I'm a lawyer, I'm not a politician. And I don't want to be a politician either. I think that time of my life is over. It was probably over 20 years ago. But I am involved in defending clients in today's Russia. Mikhail Khodorkovsky and my client Nikolai Kavkazky, who was involved in the Polotnaya case. And because I'm involved in their cases, I cannot just remain a simple lawyer. That is because values such as humanism, justice, are not values which are acknowledged by the Russian authorities today. Injustice exists, mechanisms exist which obstruct the judicial process. And in Russia we have a situation today where justice is just something which is declared. Now we've seen the introduction, or when in the past we had political dissidents included in our criminal codes. This was an awful time for our country. This is a different country. Today, in our criminal code, we don't have these political paragraphs included. And our authorities in their official propaganda repeat time and again, we don't have political prisoners in Russia. We don't have this political paragraph in our criminal code anymore. Now, this approach is primitive, it's not a new one, and it has two aims. First of all, not just to hold back the opponents, but also to repress them. And they do this so that they can say, well, what opposition in the country? We haven't got anyone to talk to. The opposition doesn't exist. And unfortunately, the propaganda in our country is often effective. If you watch state television in our country, you will see this, and access to the internet is not as widespread as it might be in our country, unfortunately, at the present time. So what are the tendencies which you can see at the present day in Russia? The issue on today's agenda. First of all, the investigative committee and the Siloviki have real control over society. They did in the past, but the situation has changed today. We're seeing the emergence of a new political force confronted with repressive authorities. And there is no secret in what is going on here. They are quite clear. They say that you will do as we say. They are saying that people are just criticizing us, that there is just always talk of corruption. This is what the official representatives of our authorities say. And they say that we are being criticized, that they are accusing of corruption, and these voices are even coming from prison. These are words of important figures in our investigative committee. So an important person in our citizen, he was a general as well. Now, his position is supported by the authorities, and they are cynical in their approach and in their support of the judiciary. They don't need to interfere with the work of the judiciary. That's the sad thing. The judiciary know what they have to do when they are confronted with these cases to support the political position of the authorities. They understand that above all, the authorities want to maintain the atmosphere of fear in the country. and that they need to guarantee to maintain their position. They understand their roles as the executive and as the judiciary. The repressive institutions carry out their tasks hand in hand, and they do so internally and external. So you have a tandem, a repressive power and our political forces as well. Now, all these different aspects need one another. In the past, there were cases against individuals. Mikhail Khodorkovsky was the single target. Now, of course, Yukos's company was also targeted, but he, as an individual, was the unique target. He was held hostage. Then there were some cases against groups, small groups. Nadzbol, the Pussy Riot case last year. But now we have cases against organized extremists. So we're talking about internal enemies. I'm sort of just slightly changing the terminology used, but only slightly. This is who they're targeting in their eyes. These people seek to undermine the authorities. And the clearest example of this is the Bolotnaya case, which is starting tomorrow. The foreign agents law, which Lyudmila Alexievna has spoken about, and experts, academics are looking at these issues which are so sensitive. So we're talking here about political activists and people who are loyal to the regime. It is clear that political repression is affecting a broader section of society. The Bolotnaya case, there are 12 accused, and the case will start tomorrow. The majority of them were just children yesterday. They were students or they just recently finished their studies. They're in Pavel's. They're about Pavel's age. I think the oldest of the accused is Pavel's age, but the rest of them are younger. We've got 20-year-old and 19-year-old. They don't have anything joining them together. They are not joined together in their political activity. They didn't know one another before they ended up in the situation which they're in now. They have had evidence piled against them through videotapes, but they have been linked together by chance. They are accused of being internal enemies. One of those accused is interested in the anarchist movement. There's another one who's interested in the liberal movement. There is another one who's accused who's interested in free love. There are students who are studying political sciences, who are just studying demonstrations. That's what they have chosen to specialize in. And the list goes on. And they have all found themselves pulled together. They are accused of, under the leadership of some unknown secret organizer. There are accusations that a Georgian member of parliament is involved, that they wanted to block Putin's third president's term. The idea of this is a joke, but their case is opening tomorrow. And some of those held are suffering from ill health. They aren't politicians, they aren't activists. They are being held to make clear to all members of civil society, you should be afraid, you should live in fear. That's the situation with the Bolotnaya case. These young people did not commit any criminal offence. I want to underscore that the idea which is being disseminated by the propaganda in our country, the idea, okay, they're saying you should never beat a policeman. Yes, okay, that's clear. You cannot attack a policeman when he is adhering to the law. But if a policeman starts to break the law himself, if he takes the law into his own hand, then the use of violence is something which any individual can use to deal with the situation with which he is confronted. Secondly, just because these young people took part in these demonstrations doesn't mean that they should now have to serve long prison sentences. But this is what is happening in the Bolotnaya case, and it is simply not acceptable. Now, unfortunately, our propaganda is also promoting these ideas that, as I have presented them, there has been no investigation into the provocative nature of the authorities' behaviour on the 6th of May in Bolotnaya Square last year. This court has been created by the authorities for another aim. What happened was that the authorities had not allowed or provided permission for the demonstrators to go onto the Bolotnaya Square. The violence which took place was beyond that area. It was clear where the demonstration was supposed to take place, and there was clear provocation on the part of the authorities. This was not justified. These people were taking part in a peaceful demonstration. In order to investigate the case to come to a fair conclusion, well, instead of doing that, the authorities made criminals out of these young people. They were provoked. At the end of 2010, in a court in Moscow, Mr. Khodorkovsky appealed to the judge. He spoke of the lies in the case against him and said that he stole money from his own company, that he said what he had to say to the prosecutor, and the prosecutor was simply indifferent to what he said, and he just read out the sentence, the new sentence. You might have thought that Mr. Khodorkovsky's words were hyperbole, but that wasn't the case. He was being quite honest in what he had said. Mr. Khodorkovsky knew what he was talking about, and the judgment against him has been analysed by experts, and it is quite clear that it is fictive. It is based on lies. And the same is true of the Bolotnaya case. The case against Alexei Navalny is the same. And it is clear that the authorities are supported by the courts. And they are all part of one single repressive system, a system which uses legal violence, a system which exists and which is maintained by its authorities and those responsible for its propaganda, and it's impossible to get involved and to interfere with their work. Now, we have also seen progress made in Yukos case and other case. Mikhail Khodorkovsky, Platon Lebedev, and we lawyers working in their cases have always been clear and repeated our criticism. They are talking about the lies and the deception and also the torture which is involved, the forgeries of thousands of pages of paper. We have seen one case being taken and being multiplied into thousands of cases. We have seen the manipulation of evidence, the fraud of evidence, accusations made against innocent people who cannot defend themselves because of the contradictions with which they are confronted. What we are confronted with are open lies. It is anti-constitutional decisions taken by the state. Now there's another tendency which my colleagues have referred to. The consistent refusal by the authorities to engage in any dialogue, even with those who are loyal to the state but who are still able to think freely. Professor Guriev is an example of that just from the past few days. An advisor to the president who was asked to analyze the Khodorkovsky-Lebediev case. Sociologists, ecologists, human rights defenders, NGOs accused of being foreign agents, they are all affected by what's going on today. The aim of the authorities is to stamp out any possibility for social dialogues, to have a nuanced discussion. There can be no criticism from within and certainly not from outside. Criticism is simply not tolerated. The message is clear. Don't lecture us. You have nothing to teach us. We know everything. We don't need your help. We don't need your Western values. We have our own values. That is the kind of thinking which exists. Now, colleagues, we of course know that we alone can be responsible citizens in our country, that we are responsible for lawfulness and justice. We are sat here, we are doing everything we can together to cooperate. Everything which we are doing is to implement the old Soviet slogan that the state should live up to its constitutional responsibilities. We understand, colleagues, members of the European Parliament, that realpolitik means that you can interpret things as you want, but realpolitik needs to guide the policies which you take. Realpolitik means that you acknowledge the human rights, an independent and free judiciary. This is important for any country, but particularly for a country which is a member of the Council of Europe. Russia, in the 21st century, we are seeing violations of the standards and values of the European Union. We are seeing violations of the UN Covenant on Human Rights, on the European Convention on Human Rights. Human rights, the rule of law, deserve a fair and open dialogue. We need to send the right signals. And we need to hear expressions of concern, and this concern can be deep concern as well. You can think back to other examples in the last century when political prisoners were helped by responses from outside. And in conclusion, colleagues, I'd like to say one more thing. It relates to the second case against Mikhail Khodorkovsky and Platon Lebediev. In the witness box, we heard from a citizen of France who used to be a director of UCOS. He spoke good Russian, and he said what a load of rubbish the accusations were, and he gave his evaluation. Now, of course, he was then humiliated by the prosecutor, who tried to get him to be quiet. They tried to intimidate him. They tried to get him to take back his words. And that's because they were frightened of what had been said. Now, this continued for quite some time. And this citizen, and I would put a capital C in front of the word citizen in this case, he listened to the attacks and he said the following. He said, "Prosecutor, I understand why you are humiliating me, insulting me, but you won't be successful. More than 200 years ago, we in France declared that there would be freedom, equality for our citizens. We establish our values. We have these values and we live by them, and we won't give them up to anyone, even if you will humiliate me and insult me as much as you possibly want and can." Now, I think this is a distinguished European citizen. There are many in Europe who would act sincerely, and they must be supported by the European authorities, and this in line with principles. This is realpolitik. Thank you.
Благодарю вас.
Thank you.
An honor to give the floor to Mr. Bill Browder, Hermitage Capital Management. We know that he continues his fearless fight for justice and human rights, and not only for the sake of Magnitsky, but I think what for our own cause. Mr. Browder, the floor is yours.
Mr. Donskis, I'd like to thank you, the ALDE Group, and also Ms. Oyland, who couldn't be here today, but who helped organize this whole event, to invite me here to share my story. For those of you who don't know me, I was the person who employed Sergei Magnitsky, whose name you've heard several times mentioned today. This is a conference about political prisoners, and Sergei Magnitsky was a political prisoner, but he's now a dead political prisoner. And I feel like it's my duty, since he died, to make sure that he gets justice, and the practices that led to his murder in Russia in detention are exposed so that other people don't die in the same way. I'm not going to repeat the whole story of what happened to Sergei because it's pretty well known and it's pretty well written up. What I'd like to talk about today is why this one story has taken on such political significance. Sergei Magnitsky, in very brief terms, uncovered a government corruption scheme, exposed it, was tortured for 358 days, and was killed. And he's not the only one who was killed in prison. There's probably thousands of other stories like this of people who have been killed in Russian detention by the authorities. What makes this story particularly political and international and emblematic is the reaction of the Russian government after they killed him. Sergei Magnitsky was unusual in only one respect, in that he wrote everything down that happened to him when he was incarcerated. He wrote 450 complaints in his 358 days in detention. And so we have a day-by-day documentary record of who did what to him, when they did it, how they did it, where they did it. And from that, we expected that there would be justice done for his death. And what was most remarkable to me and to everybody around Sergei was that in spite of this mountain of documentary evidence, they did everything that they could, the Russian authorities did everything they could to cover up his death. On the day after he died, the Interior Ministry announced that he died of natural causes. There was no signs of violence. Even though he had been deliberately and sadistically denied medical attention, they said he was never sick. Even though he uncovered a massive government corruption scheme, they said there was no corruption scheme. And then they went on to promote and even give state awards to the people who did it to him. I couldn't take this injustice, and I wasn't going to just accept that Russia was an unjust place where impunity reigns. And so I said to myself, if we can't get justice inside of Russia, let's get justice outside of Russia. Now, how do we get justice outside of Russia? Unfortunately, murder in a Russian prison doesn't have jurisdiction in Belgium or the United Kingdom or the United States. The crimes that were committed against Sergei have jurisdiction in Russia, and the Russian authorities refuse to prosecute anyone for those crimes. And then we said to ourselves, well, what was this crime all about? This crime was all about the theft of $230 million of taxes that a number of corrupt Interior Ministry officers and government officials perpetrated and that Sergei Magnitsky exposed. And we said to ourselves, maybe we can't prosecute them for murder today, but these people who steal this money don't want to keep this money in Russia. They want to keep this money in a safe place. They want to keep this money in a place that actually has property rights and a rule of law. They want to keep the money in the West. They want to keep the money in the West. They want to travel to the West. They want to educate their children in the West. And this is something that we do have jurisdiction over, is whether people should be allowed to travel to the West, whether they should be allowed to use the banking system in the West. And so about 3 years ago, we came up with the idea of trying to deprive them of these privileges. And we started this process both in the European Parliament and in the US Congress. And it was a good idea. It was a good idea for anyone who we told this to, because it doesn't cost a lot of money. This doesn't involve big prosecutions. It doesn't involve anything other than taking away something which is a privilege, a visa or a privilege to use the US banking system. So as we started to move along in this whole thing, it got real traction in the US Congress. And eventually we found a number of US politicians on both different sides, on the Republican side and the Democratic side, who sponsored what was originally called the Justice for Sergei Magnitsky Act. And the Justice for Sergei Magnitsky Act imposed visa sanctions and asset freezes on the people who were responsible for Sergei's death. And when this idea was launched, it lit up the Moscow sky. And a number of other victims of the same type of abuse came forward in Washington to these senators and said, this is an amazing and very, very clearly resonant piece of legislation. Could you add the people who killed my father, my mother, my brother, my son to your law? And after hearing a number of these approaches, the senators who sponsored this legislation decided to broaden it, and they called it the Sergei Magnitsky Rule of Law Accountability Act. And they broadened it by adding about 20 words to say, in addition to the people who killed Sergei Magnitsky, this should include the people who perpetrate other gross human rights abuses in Russia. And after that, it was like a dominoes falling in Washington, and everybody on both sides of the aisle, in both houses of Congress, supported it. And on December 12th last year, President Obama signed the Sergei Magnitsky Rule of Law Accountability Act, which imposes visa sanctions and asset freezes on the people who killed Sergei and the people who perpetrate other gross human rights abuses. It was a big success. Now the Russians then reacted in a profoundly harsh way. The Russians said to themselves, this is just a terrible, terrible thing for us, because this is what they covet most, is their ability to travel and their ability to keep their money safe. And so they looked for ways that they could somehow retaliate. And the first idea of retaliation was to they came up with a draft resolution that would freeze the assets of certain American financial institutions in Russia. And I actually saw one of these draft resolutions. And I was amazed. And I guess somewhere along the line, cooler heads prevailed. And someone probably said, if you do that, they're going to freeze Russian assets in America. And I'm sure Putin said, well, we can't have that. This involves money. As far as I'm aware, the next idea that was floated around was, well, why don't we cut off military hardware supplies into Afghanistan? And I would imagine that the cooler heads prevailed, saying, well, if we do that to them, then they'll stop our military supply of hardware into Syria. And then they came up with the most amazing and most unbelievably sadistic idea that I've seen, and I've seen a lot of bad things, which was to say, well, the Americans like to adopt our disabled children, our disabled orphans. Let's take that away from them. And so shortly after the Magnitsky Act was passed, the Russian government banned the adoption of disabled Russian orphans because there was nobody who could fight back on that one. These children couldn't fight back. And I'm very sad and heartbroken to say that just yesterday I learned of the first death of one of these orphans who was ill, who had, if they had been adopted by an American family, they probably could have been saved. The Russians did this adoption ban partially to get back at the Americans, but they also did this adoption ban to show that they're absolutely crazy, angry about the Magnitsky Act. And who did they want to show that they were crazy, angry to? They wanted to show it to the Europeans. Why did they want to show it to the Europeans? Because America might be symbolic in terms of their actions, but in Europe is where the Russians keep all their money. They probably have 20 times the amount of money in Europe as they do in America, and they probably do 20 times the amount of traveling to Europe as they do in America. And what the Russians really wanted to do was to make sure that the Magnitsky Act never happened in Europe. And they've been, so far, pretty successful. In parallel to what we were doing in Washington, we went to the European Parliament, and the European Parliament, through the good work of Mr. Donskis and Ms. Oyland and Mr. Schultz and let me see if there's others out there, Mr. Landersbergis and various others, put together, and if I'm missing anybody, please forgive me. The European Parliament passed a resolution last November calling on the European Council, the Council of Ministers, to do the same thing that was done in America, to impose Magnitsky sanctions in Europe, imposing visa sanctions and asset freezes on the people who killed Magnitsky and the people who do other gross human rights abuses. And there's been deafening silence. So in that time of deafening silence, I then started to try to work on individual member states. And one of the individual member states I went to was Ireland. I went to the Irish Parliament, and I asked, and I told the story of Sergei Magnitsky, and I asked the Irish Parliament if they would support the idea of calling on their government to impose Magnitsky sanctions in Ireland and to use their presidency of the European Union to do the same thing. And there were a number of people that were very compelled by my testimony, but one person in the Parliament said, let's hear the Russian side of the story before we decide. And so they asked the Russian ambassador to Dublin to come and testify. He refused to come and testify, but he did send in a letter a few weeks later. And it was a 4-page letter, and I got to see a copy. And on 3 3/4 pages of the letter, where it was invective directed towards me and Sergei Magnitsky to say what a bunch of crooks we were. But the very last few sentences said, and if you were to do this, we will ban the adoption of Russian children by Irish parents. And immediately, the people in the Parliament of Ireland folded. And I don't blame them for folding. It's a small country, and they were being threatened by a very big and very nasty and very powerful country. And what it made me realize was that there's no way that individual countries in Europe are going to be able to do this, and this is the whole point of having a European Union, so that Europe can stand together to deal with these types of difficult and pleasant situations. And so I come back to the European Parliament at a moment when there's an amazing opportunity has presented itself to make this thing happen. Now, while the Russians were doing all of this nasty adoption banning, and by the way, putting also Sergei Magnitsky himself on trial posthumously, and various other terrible things, and all these other terrible stories that you've just heard here on the panel, they've also been asking or begging, I should say, to get visa-free travel for 15,000 Russian officials. And interestingly, the European Union has said yes. They said yes. Now, the European Parliament can't compel the European Union to impose Magnitsky sanctions. It can only recommend. However, the European Parliament can and should veto the decision and the agreement between the European Union and Russia on these 15,000 service passports. The European Parliament has the power to veto. And so what's happened in the last few days, and I think this is probably the most significant thing that's happened in Europe in relation to Magnitsky sanctions, is that 47 members of the European Parliament wrote a letter to all foreign ministers and all interior ministers of Europe to say that they will veto this if the Magnitsky sanctions don't get passed. And this is our big opportunity. And there's a lot of very, very terrible things going on in Russia right now that we've all heard about, and many, many more terrible things we'll never have the chance to talk about here. And there's very, very few things that can be done inside of Russia, very few things we can do inside of Russia. But this is one thing we can do outside of Russia, which has a profound effect on these people. And I would urge you all, whether you're members of parliament or members of the staff or members of the press, to support us in putting this right front and center as the way in which we get the Magnitsky sanctions passed in Europe, because that's the thing that's going to affect these people most profoundly. Thank you.
Mr. Brother, thank you very much indeed. Now I have a pleasure to give the floor to Ms. Anna Karetnikova, Council of Human Rights Center Memorial.
Здравствуйте, очень рада вас видеть.
Good afternoon. I am very happy to be here. I am from the Council of the Human Rights Centre Memorial. I think that you may have heard of our organisation. A few days ago, we were informed that we had to stop getting involved in politics, or we would be called foreign agents, all because we support the rights of political prisoners. Just yesterday, it became clear that an EU programme we'd applied for funding from had not given us funding, so we'll continue to rely on the contributions of volunteers, as we have done for the past years. Since 2011, there's been a lot of repression, but even before that, there were political prisoners. Obviously, the main ones being the representatives of Yukos, Platon Lebedev and Mikhail Khodorkovsky, people who were held in prison camps, Vasily Alexian, who died just a few months after he was freed from custody. We helped fight for him, but sadly we couldn't stop this happening. There were academics accused of espionage, Danilov. There were the victims of the so-called Chechen investigation. People accused of trying to blow up a bomb in Moscow. People who were simply listening to Chechen songs. And one of these people is now in exile in France and is scared to return to Russia. There was, of course, the National Bolshevik case. But despite their rather worrying-sounding name, most of the people accused were actually non-violent. Since 2011, after the start of major action from civil society, a new wave of repression has started, and the number of political prisoners has increased a lot. we're no longer talking about tens, but about hundreds. Hundreds of political prisoners who are either under arrest or under investigation or have already been tried and convicted. The Human Rights Centre Memorial works with other organisations to come up with criteria for what constitutes a political prisoner in coordination with European and international standards. We have criteria for defining someone as a political prisoner. Firstly, political motive, either on the part of the victim or on the part of the state. We've talked about the criminal code, and we've heard the accusations that these people are apparently thieves, crooks, drug addicts, and so we're trying to classify the cases. First of all, political persecution, which is when someone is accused of a crime because of their political activity. This is often linked to provoking hatred or to provoking disorder or to organising riots. There are also accusations of hooliganism or actions aiming to provoke hatred. The obvious example being the Pussy Riot case, which became world famous because it was absolutely obvious that the article of the criminal code that was used was completely inappropriate to the case, that the girls were sentenced to years in prison completely illegally, and that was obvious. Now, on the anti-extremist laws. These were used against Konstantin Krylov, a human rights activist who has fairly right-wing views, because he said we have to get rid of this terrible economic model. I'm not sure what's extremist about that, but he was accused of extremism. And as for accusations of causing mass disorder, these accusations were made against Lebedev and against the people behind a film called Protest 2. Lebedev has already been tried and sentenced to 2.5 years imprisonment. Udaltsov is under house arrest, others are in custody awaiting trial, and it's clear that they will all be sentenced to prison. But just a few words. I am part of a voluntary organization in Moscow which has the right to go into police cells, which has the right to go into prison cells and to look at the conditions there. We heard from people who said that they had been tortured, and we went to Lefortovo to talk to one of them, and we were not allowed in. Me and the chair of our organisation were kept waiting for hours, and we said, look, you can keep us waiting here all night, we're not going away. And we talked to this prisoner who said that he was arrested in Ukraine, pushed into a bus, kept in a cellar, accused of a crime that he didn't commit, and he was threatened with murder. They said, look, we can just make you disappear and no one will ever find you. This was all to get him to confess. He didn't confess, and so he was led out in handcuffs, and this is why he's now under accusation for all sorts of things. So it's not just the May the 6th case. Another form of legal persecution is investigating civil rights activists concerned with these activities. And this is a lot more difficult because these activists can be accused of anything. For example, they can have drugs planted on them, which happened to one trade union representative. And for possession with intent to supply, he was given 8 years. He has a daughter who's sick with diabetes, but nobody cared about that. And there's one article which is used very often against the opposition, accusation of resisting arrest, fighting against the police. This was the accusation for the Bolotnaya protests. It was used against a prisoner who later died in prison after apparently falling out of a window. It was used against one prisoner who apparently ran into a police station and started hitting officers, and she was given 4 years. And it's being used again against others. Article 317. I talked about Daniel Konstantinov with fairly right-wing views, who was accused under anti-extremist laws. He refused to confess, and then after a few months he was accused of a murder which took place before the first accusation of extremism, that apparently in the metro he had murdered someone who was a complete stranger to him. Konstantinov had a cast iron alibi. On that day, he was at his mother's birthday party with a lot of friends and relatives. So there were a large number of witnesses who saw him there. There are phone records, purchase records for presents which prove that he was there. And he was not in the metro when the murder happened. Despite this, he spent 2.5 years on remand, and he's accused of murder on the basis of the testimony of one witness who only recognized Konstantinov the 3rd time he saw him. One witness. And this witness is obviously under the police's control because during the investigation he committed 6 burglaries and he's now under witness protection. That's all that really needs to be said about the case. There are people who have been accused of making a fence dirty, a fence that belonged to the local governor. And apparently they were writing on the fence, and they were put under arrest for that. But we have to make a distinction between political persecution and case of the police simply doing whatever they want. There's the case of one activist, Vadim Karolin, who was the victim of a breach of the highway code by civil servants. For the last few years, there's been a fight against a way that a lot of civil servants drive with sirens and break all the laws of the road. And this person was the victim of an accident because he was driving on the right side of the road and he crashed into an official car which was on the wrong side of the road. And for this, he was accused of attacking a public servant. Thankfully, the court gave him bail, even though the prosecutor wanted him put on remand for driving on the right side of the road. But this is rare in Russia. It's rare for the court to give someone bail if the prosecution doesn't want them to. I'm not going to read the text of the law, but I just want to say that as a lawyer, I could simply say that under what's in the criminal code, anyone in Russia could be accused of being a foreign agent because we have given information to foreign organizations, we've had contact with them, and that's enough under the letter of the law. So what help do we want from you? Firstly, to put pressure on Russian authorities to bring in sanctions against civil servants who violate human rights, by analogy with the Magnitsky law that we mentioned today. To make sure that the Russian Federation respects its obligations under the Council of Europe treaties and the European Convention on Human Rights. Oh, and one problem that I forgot to mention earlier was that a lot of people are being forced to emigrate because we wake up in the morning, we look at the computer, and we see a list of people who've been arrested. A lot of people who have been involved in the Bolotnaya protests have had to leave the country. And so we would ask you to be more favourable to asylum applications from Russians. But this is a question above all, not for Europe, but for Ukrainian authorities, because Ukraine is the main destination for Russian refugees. And remember that if someone has criminal convictions in Russia, don't look at their criminal convictions as signs they're actually a criminal. It might well be political if they have political activities. And the people from the Bolotnaya protests, there aren't just young people. There's Sergei Klivov, who is quite a lot older. And all these people are within the tradition of political prisoners. They are writing letters, they're keeping up correspondence, they're keeping up their morale, even though this is extremely difficult in a Russian prison. And in meetings, I'm going to finish with what I always say at meetings: freedom to political prisoners, one for all and all for one.
Спасибо. Yes, and now I have a pleasure to give the floor to our final speaker, Mr. Vladimir Kara-Murza, from Coordinating Council of the Russian Opposition. Yeah, the floor is yours.
Very much, and I want to start by thanking the ALDE Group and the many true friends of Russia in the European Parliament, not of Putin but of Russia, who have shown their commitment and their support for so many years to our civil society and our pro-democracy forces. And thank you especially for holding this topical event. It's unfortunately topical because, as has been said, the Russian political landscape today includes no longer just falsified elections and media censorship, but also political show trials, such as the one starting tomorrow. Also, the truly 1930s-style state-driven paranoia about so-called foreign agents, and yes, dozens and possibly hundreds, as Anna mentioned, of political prisoners. Pavel said that Mr. Putin has on several occasions publicly stated that Russia has no political prisoners today. Of course, in doing this, he's just continuing the old Soviet tradition. You may remember that in the 50s, Nikita Khrushchev announced publicly that there are no political prisoners in the Soviet Union, and those who oppose the Soviet regime are either criminals, and that's why they're in prison, or they are mentally insane. And that was the start of the notorious and horrid practice of so-called punitive psychiatry when dissidents were sent, including such prominent dissidents as Grigorenko, Bukovsky, Gorbanevsky, and many others, were sent to mental institutions and held there in basically torturous conditions. So this is just, again, a continuation of the old traditions, and actually, in a way, some officials today are more honest, such as, for instance, Igor Shuvalov, the current deputy prime minister, who several years ago said to The Economist magazine that Mikhail Khodorkovsky is in prison for political reasons, as an example to others, or General Vladimir Markin, whom my colleague Vadim Kluvgan has mentioned, who said in an interview with Izvestia newspaper that Alexei Navalny's prosecution has been expedited because he was, quote, teasing the authorities. So after a brief interlude, the 1990s, so vilified and smeared by Putin's official propaganda, the only period in modern Russian history when we didn't have a single political prisoner in the 1990s, the Kremlin is back to its old habits. And of course, we can't name the exact number. It may be scores or dozens, it may be hundreds, as Anna suggested. But in any case, this is already comparable to the late Soviet period. In his Nobel speech in 1975, which was read by Elena Bonner in Oslo, Andrei Sakharov listed 118 political prisoners, and those were, of course, just the ones he knew personally, so there were more than that. But I think we can talk about pretty comparable figures to the Brezhnev-Andropov period in any case. And as has been mentioned, in the year that Putin's been officially back in the Kremlin, the number of political prisoners in Russia has increased dramatically, mainly, of course, due to the Bolotnaya case, which was described. And I also urge you to have a look at this report that former Prime Minister Kasyanov brought here, which details the baseless allegations and tells the actual story that happened on Bolotnaya. And when we talk about analogies with the 1930s, as many of us on this panel did, I also think it should be noted that this is no longer hyperbole. It's really not, because Leonid Rozvozhaev, whom Anna Karetnikova mentioned, has been kidnapped on a sovereign territory of a foreign country and forcibly brought back to Russia, where he was tortured for 2 days into signing a confession that he was acting on behalf of a foreign government to do some kind of subversive activities. If that's not the 1930s, I don't know what is. But, and then of course Russia's most prominent and I would say most emblematic political prisoner, Mikhail Khodorkovsky, as was also said, is marking his 10th year of arrest this year. Now, one of the ways Western democracies helped Soviet political prisoners in those days was through holding exchanges, as we know. People such as Vladimir Bukovsky, who I know many on this panel are honored to call a friend, Alexander Ginsburg, Yuri Orlov, and many, many others gained their freedom this way, through exchanges. It has been suggested, I know, that this practice be revived. I'm not sure if that is realistic in today's conditions. But there is another type of exchange that I think Western democracies, and the European Union in particular, should practice in their relations with Putin's Kremlin. An example of this type of exchange was shown last year by the US Congress in passing the Sergei Magnitsky Rule of Law Accountability Act, which was done in exchange for granting Russia permanent normal trade relations status and in exchange for abolishing the Jackson-Vanik Amendment. And I think this is exactly the type of model, as Bill Browder has said, to follow with this demand by Mr. Putin to allow thousands of Russian government officials, holders of so-called blue passports, into the European Union. And this letter by several dozen members of the European Parliament that was published yesterday or the day before, I think should be praised and supported, and that's and the only way this proposal by Mr. Putin can be accepted, is in my view, is in exchange for a European Magnitsky Law for the European Union. Now, we talked about how the Kremlin leaders of today are in so many ways similar to their Soviet-era predecessors, both in style and in substance. But there is one major difference. When they were harassing and jailing dissenters and keeping them in prisons and mental institutions, Brezhnev, Suslov, and Andropov did not buy real estate in France, open up bank accounts in Germany, and send their children to study in Great Britain. Today's leaders do. And this is why the leverage that Western Europe has over the Kremlin today is incomparable with the Soviet days. And I want to add that this is not just leverage, but this is actually an obligation. Because both Russia and every single European Union member state are members of the OSCE. They're bound by the OSCE Moscow document, which states, among other things, and I quote, "Issues relating to human rights, fundamental freedoms, democracy, and the rule of law are of international concern and do not belong exclusively to the internal affairs of the state concerned," end of quote. So we know it's nonsense when Mr. Lavrov and other people from the Russian Foreign Ministry say that human rights are their internal affairs. But everybody's used to that. It was, however, astonishing to hear that last week from a senior European Union official just before the EU-Russia summit in Yekaterinburg, when, as Reuters reported on Friday, the senior source in European Union leadership said that the case of Sergei Magnitsky will not be raised at the Ekaterinburg summit because that is, quote, an internal matter, end of quote, for the Russian legal system. That is simply untrue. But in fact, unfortunately, if we believe Mr. Chizhov, the permanent Russian representative of the European Union, the case of Sergei Magnitsky was indeed not mentioned by the European Union leaders at the Ekaterinburg summit. And I think that's not something to really be proud of. Contrary to what the Kremlin propaganda drumbeat keeps going on about, the Magnitsky law is not anti-Russian. In fact, I would say this is the most pro-Russian law to have ever been passed by any foreign parliament. Despite all the propaganda, a strong plurality of Russian citizens, according to a poll by the Levada Center, of course another newly installed, quote, foreign agent, 44% to be precise, support the idea of North American and Western European visa and financial sanctions against those who violate human rights. This is a very simple premise. Those people who continue to abuse the rights and steal the money from Russian citizens should not have the privilege of enjoying the comfort and the security of the Western world and the European Union for themselves and for their families. There should be some personal consequences for their action. There should be some personal responsibility. So the next time, those people may think twice before they beat up and arrest another protester, or torture another prisoner, or harass another journalist, or rig another election. In fact, this is not a groundbreaking or fresh original idea. For years, EU visa and financial sanctions have targeted officials and operatives from the Lukashenko regime in Belarus and from the Mugabe regime in Zimbabwe for doing exactly those things: political repressions, suppression of the rule of law, election fraud, and other violations. There is no reason why Putin's officials should enjoy some kind of special treatment. And I want to end this, as some of my colleagues did, on a positive note, because Russian society is rapidly changing, and even compared to 2 years ago, the situation is markedly different. Yes, on the official level, on the political level, the situation is, and I think Human Rights Watch has described it aptly, as the worst in the post-Soviet period, because it truly is, because of all those things that have been mentioned here today. But there's also another movement going on in Russia. We've seen from the end of 2011 as tens and hundreds of thousands of people came out in the streets to protest against the lies, the injustice, the repression, and the corruption of this regime. There are millions of people in today's Russia who are fed up with living under this system. And the driving force, the backbone of this movement, of this trend, is Russia's growing urban middle class, the younger, the more educated, the professionals, the driving force of any modern society. Even according to the official, quote-unquote, results of last year's presidential election, results announced by Churov, Vladimir Putin lost majority support in Moscow, in Omsk, in Kaliningrad, in Vladivostok, and in many other Russian towns and cities. A poll in April conducted by the Levada Center showed that for the first time, an overall majority of Russians, more than 50%, consider United Russia Party to be the party of crooks and thieves, slogan popularized by Alexei Navalny, who's currently on trial. And that only 26% want Mr. Putin to remain as president beyond the end of his current term. I think given the total control over all the central television networks in Russia, those are remarkable results, and they should be paid attention to. Now, it is, of course, only our task, the task of Russian citizens, to bring about democratic change in our country. This cannot, and I might add, should not be done from any outside forces. But if our friends and neighbors and partners in the European Union want to show solidarity with the Russian people, if they want to show that those commitments to the rule of law and democracy and human rights are more than just words put on a piece of paper, the best way and the most effective way they could do so would be to tell those crooks and those abusers that they are no longer welcome here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, dear colleagues. We had a wonderful panel debate. I have to say that I'm really grateful to all of these wonderful and courageous people for their wonderful papers, and I think it's much food for thought. Now we have a short question and answer session, and please, would you be kind enough to confine your question and comment to 2-3 minutes, because we have only 15 minutes left, and still I believe there would be some people who would like to raise a point and question. Yes, please, go ahead.
Thank you, sir. My name's Deborah Newton-Cook, and I'm here in my capacity as a citizen, and I'm here with my daughter, who would also like to ask a question. Mr. Khodorkovsky talked about his father being in prison for 10 years, in prison for nothing. Now, I've been campaigning for Palestinians, and there are more than 10,000 Palestinians who are in administrative detention, and some of them have been there for more, including children and women, who have been there for more than 10 years. Madam Alexeyeva said, quote, 70,000 people attended a meeting. Well, as a UK Liberal Democrat, that would be a miracle. But congratulations to those brave people for doing that. We had suffragettes in the UK who lost their lives for women to have the vote in the UK, which is sadly not used. So my question is, what do you think will be the future for Russia, and would you apply to be a member of the European Union? Thank you.
Yes, would you like to take this question? Would you like to address Mr. Khodorkovsky or Ms. Alexeyeva?
Well, whoever would like to reply, I don't mind.
Thank you for the question. I mean, the answer is unambiguously yes. I do believe that although historically Russia was seen as a sort of barrier between Europe and Asia, I think that I speak on behalf of approximately 142 million people in Russia that do feel that their cultural and historic legacy lay much closer to the European values and the European history, and our country would welcome becoming part of the European Union. The one set of obstacles that I see on the path to that is, of course, the fact that Russia is not currently governed by the rule of law, and reestablishing the rule of law in Russia is a primary goal, upon achieving which we can talk about joining the European Union as a member state.
Yes, thank you. Yes, please, go ahead.
Merci beaucoup pour la...
Thank you for the invitation. I'm glad to be here as a European citizen. I have 2 questions. Before having a discussion in the European Parliament about whether it's possible to visit political prisoners in Europe on behalf of the European Union, I think that's a way in which we can help them, and it would be a real opportunity to see what's going on in Russia. All these human rights abuses seem to be associated with Mr. Putin. It doesn't seem to matter whether he's the president or the prime minister. It's he who leads the Russian Federation. But how many European officials are in favor of Mr. Putin having accumulated such wealth, and the wealth which has been accumulated of the members of his entourage? How do we know exactly how much money they have? That's my question.
Я очень быстро по последнему пункту.
I'll answer the last point. Just on your last question on the money, the last figure which we heard, which was published in the Spiegel, it's a German newspaper, I think. That's from 2005, 2016, on Putin's personal fortune, and we think it's over $40 billion. There's no proof on that. I think it's well hidden, the money. You won't find it registered anywhere. But there are officials and civil servants who are close to Putin, and it's easier to see how big their fortunes are. There is proof of that. You can check in the European Union and in the United States. Alexei Navalny, he's an anti-corruption blogger, has uncovered a lot of these figures. The head of Mr. Putin's party in the Duma had bought flats in Florida worth more than $2 million. And then recently, just 2 months ago, a Finnish newspaper published an article and said that Mikhail Khodorkovsky, who is Mr. Putin's former press minister, who is also responsible for the destruction of some independent TV channels in Russia, and whose name has been mentioned in a decision taken by the European Court of Human Rights, so there's real documentation here, that he has a large house in Finland, so in the European Union. It's worth more than 2 million euros. So that's information published by the Finnish newspaper. Now, we do hear reports from time to time. Sometimes they're documented, sometimes they're not. But what's clear is that these people don't want to invest their money in Russia. They are sending their money to Western Europe. And that's why Europe absolutely must follow the example of the United States in the introduction of the Magnitsky Act, which we've discussed today. In the first part of the question, I think there are other colleagues who are better placed to answer this relating to Mr. Khodorkovsky's case.
Well, on the first question, I'll just give you one example. In my opinion, this is enough. A member of the European Parliament and the German Bundestag, with the support of the German Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the German Embassy in Moscow, managed to meet Mikhail Khodorkovsky after a lot of effort to find where he was being held and to get the necessary permission. She went there at the end of last year, if I remember correctly, and wasn't let in, and she wasn't given a reason why. The embassy made a formal written request for explanation by Russian federal authorities, and the answer, I think, you can make your own opinion on. The Federal Prison Service answered that the administration of the prison camp refused the visit. So I haven't heard the European Parliament or any other international organisation make any protest against this. There may have been a protest and I missed it. Well.
Yes, please go ahead.
У меня вопрос к господину Касьянову.
I have a question for about Mr. Kasyanov. You said that the European Court of Human Rights looks at a large number of complaints by Russian citizens and sees them in a positive light. However, on the Khodorkovsky case, the ECHR decided that there wasn't motive to call him a political prisoner. What can you say about the ECHR decision? Thank you.
Мои коллеги, Вадим Клювган добавит, он, потому что главный адвокат.
My colleague can say more about this. Mr. Kluvgand was Mr. Khodorkovsky's main lawyer, but I'll just say a few words. The problem is that the first case before the ECHR was Khodorkovsky's complaint about his arrest. However, The second complaint was about Khodorkovsky's first conviction. At the time, I was Prime Minister, and I gave the ECHR proof that there were political reasons. Because at the time I was Prime Minister and I criticised the public prosecutor for fabricating evidence. And sadly, the ECHR hasn't looked at this case for reasons that I don't understand, even though it was treated as admissible 2 years ago. Simply to add something, this was an excellent question, and I think that it deserves an answer, definitely. Saying that the ECHR didn't see political rationale behind Khodorkovsky's conviction, that isn't entirely correct. And the problem is that, as Mr. Kasyanov said, the ECHR did not look into any matters concerning Khodorkovsky's trial. And I have to be clear on this. As it stands, the ECHR has not made any comment about the accusations levelled against Khodorkovsky, even in his first trial, or on the verdict of the court. And certainly nothing about what happened later, about the second accusation, the second trial. The ECHR has not made any decisions on this. It has not reached any verdict on this. This is a tragic fact for us, but that is the fact. We don't understand the reasons why this is taking so long, and when we've tried to obtain explanations about this, we haven't received any response. But if we look at the first complaint, which purely concerns Khodorkovsky's arrest in October 2003, and his conditions while under arrest, the ECHR looked at the serious violations of Mr. Khodorkovsky's rights, and on the basis of Article 18 of the Convention, namely political motivation, the formulation used there is that the process is defined under the ECHR cannot be used for any purposes other than to protect human rights and the rule of law. The ECHR stated that a large number of bodies, Russian, international, public, private, saw political motives in Khodorkovsky's case. And the ECHR simply stated that certain people believe this. It also said that the burden of proof was such that it had to be made clear, absolutely clear, that all state authorities, from the beginning to the end, their actions had to be completely illegal in order for an action to be considered to be purely political. I'm not going to say that the ECHR was right or wrong in a certain area, but if we look at the analysis of the result of the verdict by experts in European law. On this precise part, the ECHR had moved away from its precedents and made its conditions stronger. In previous cases, when the ECHR had looked at complaints under Article 18, it had never used such a clear and strict burden of proof. And we don't really know the reason for this change of jurisprudence either.
I have to close the session due to the time constraints. And before I thank our panelists, our speakers, I would like to inform you that immediately after the conference, everything will be followed by the reception, and you will be able to see the photographic exhibition which is about the Volotnaya case and the demonstrators sent to prison since May 6, 2012.